and I both underscore and agree that trade can be pro-growth. It's like when people ask me, as I'm a commentator on the economy, they say, Jared, how's the economy doing? How's GDP doing? And my answer is always, well, whose economy are you talking about? Because we have a very serious distributional problem in this country. So you can't just hold out GDP growth in a debate about whether the working class is undermined by trade when I've just recited a set of statistics showing that, in fact, their hourly wage has been zero in terms of growth for 40 years. And this gets to one of my main objections to the other side's argument, which is, trade enables people to buy a lot of cheap stuff. No question, that's true. But that's reflected in the real calculations of the wage story and the income story that we're telling. So maybe if trade doubled its amount of cheap stuff that people could buy, their real incomes would grow, but their real incomes have not grown. They've been flat or they've fallen.
Jason Furman, yeah.
I'd love to take on the topic of inequality. I think there is way too much inequality in this country. If you look at the top 1%, it gets about, the top 1% today gets about 20% of the income. One thing Jared's been doing is he's been referring to the period 1973 to the present. It's really important to unpack that period. From 1973 to 1990, there was very little growth of trade with developing countries. The growth of trade over that period was with countries just as rich as the United States, and we were selling things like cars back and forth to each other, the same type of stuff. Since 2000, trade with developing countries has exploded, particularly trade with China. Now let's go back to that top 1% share. It doubled before China entered the WTO from about 9% to about 20%. Since then, it's risen by 1 percentage point. If you look at it after taxes and transfers, its share of the top 1% has fallen by 1%. Economists who study inequality widely know that the fastest period of increasing inequality was in the 1980s, when we weren't trading very much with Mexico. We were trading barely at all. First of all, two things here. One, I think correctly measured, real wages are higher. The idea that people are worse off materially than they were in the early 1970s, I think, is absurd if you look at the set of material goods that people have today compared to then. But second of all, even if they were, that doesn't prove it was trade. That's what I was just getting at, John, that the period of expanded trade with developing countries is not the same as the period of very rapidly rising inequality. And in some sense, that calls into question Jared's causal link between trade and the statement about the working class.
The hourly wage numbers are as I recited them. That's not controversial, and James.
You can use CPI.
James acknowledged that. The reason why middle-income families have higher incomes now, in many cases, is not because they have more wage growth than I've said. I've just given you the statistics. It's because they're working a lot more hours. They've compensated for stagnant wages with more hours of work. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of that comes from more women in the workforce, which is a very positive advance. But the wage stagnation is a real factor that's at the heart of our case for undermining the middle class. Now, the 1980s was a period of large, big negative trade deficits that put our manufacturers in competition with workers in other countries who weren't necessarily from developing countries. I agree with Jason's point there. But we were on the losing side of that competition, as is demonstrated by the trade imbalances of that period.